Okay, so almost right on time. Shall we get started? So welcome everyone to the Nam Center for Korean Studies Colloquium, the first of the academic year. Most of you know me already, but my name is Youngju Ryu, and I'm the director of the Nam Center. So if you are like me, someone who is utterly flummoxed by what's happening in Korean politics today, then I can tell you that you are at the right place this afternoon. It was not so long ago, as you recall, that in the afterglow of the so-called candlelight revolution in 2016, 2017, when there was at the same time much liberal hand-wringing in other parts of the world, Western world, that Korea was praised by none other than the Washington Post as that one place in the world that is now teaching the world how to do democracy. Short 5 years later, that same democracy has somehow resulted in an administration that seems dead set on rolling back much of the liberal progressive gains that were made since 2017 with just spectacular speed. So if you're flummoxed or dismayed or interested by that strange set of events and interested in understanding that a little bit better, our speaker today is, to my mind, the most clear-eyed commentator writing about Korean democracy today. A scholar whose scholarship is truly public-facing, and a rare breed of political scientist whose feet are firmly planted on the ground in Korea. And that's actually much rarer than it should be, but it is rare. So it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Erik Mobrand, Korea Policy Chair and Senior Political Scientist at RAND Corporation. Dr. Mobrand received his PhD in political science from Princeton University and was an assistant professor of political science at National University of Singapore and associate professor at Seoul National University before he joined RAND. Dr. Mobrand is the author of Top-Down Democracy in South Korea and many, many articles. He will talk to us today on the topic of Washington's democracy in Asia, South Korea, and the prospects of a global partnership. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mobrand.
Well, thanks, Professor Yu, for that generous, overly generous introduction. I can't promise to offer any clarity. I may muddy the waters really today, but let's see how it goes. It's really an honor to be invited to be here today. So I'm really, really happy to be here. In Korea, there's a lot of pride in autumn. It's not the only place, it turns out, with 4 seasons. And autumn is looking good here today in Michigan. So I will jump straight into my remarks, and I think my remarks today are going to cut into a range of topics, some related to contemporary US-South Korea ties, some related to the prospects for regionalism in Asia, some related to democracy in Korea today. We have a literature scholar whose work more than shades into the study of politics, I think. And so I hope you will indulge a student of politics who is going to try to trespass a little bit into the study of stories and symbols, because I think that is also important for understanding the kind of role that South Korea might play in the Asian region. So in May this year, US President Biden met with the newly elected South Korean president, and they agreed to expand the alliance into a global partnership. I'm going to throw out a lot of buzzwords here. And part of our discussion today, I think, is to investigate or perhaps try to create possible meanings for these buzzwords. But I think we should have them on the table because the official people use them and they get thrown around in commentaries. So they've agreed to expand the alliance into a global partnership, whatever that may be. South Korea for its part, is now aspiring to be a global pivotal state, sometimes even called a GPS. Hopefully that's not used too much. All right, so another buzzword we have. I think part of the vision from Washington is that South Korea can play a sort of broker role in, here comes another buzzword, the Indo-Pacific strategy, whatever that means. In that role, it's going to lead cooperation in possibly a wide variety of fields, including perhaps security, economic relations and economic regulation, technology, and also democracy, human rights, other areas of shared values with the United States. What I'd like to do today is explore all of that with a particular focus on cooperation in the democracy domain, and with an even more focus on the question of why we have not seen Korea play a larger role to date in leading the region in terms of democracy cooperation. This could be formal cooperation among governments in the region, or it could be supporting NGOs to conduct transnational promotion of democracy or safeguarding of democracy, discussion of democracy. Why have we not seen more of that to date? Perhaps by responding to this question, we can get some purchase on these broader issues of the role that South Korea could play in leading the Asian region, perhaps nested in some sort of Indo-Pacific strategy. I think there are good reasons to expect that Korea might have already played a bigger role in regional organizing around democracy in the region. For one, activists in places like Taiwan in particular, but also some parts of Southeast Asia, have long looked up to their counterparts in Korea. In the 1980s and into the 1990s, we have a whole generation of Taiwanese activists who were enthralled with what activists in Korea were doing and were eager to learn more and to liaise. I think we're seeing something similar in certain parts of Southeast Asia today. We have, I think, governments in the region that also can imagine and would be interested in prompting South Korea to play this role. I've spoken with representatives of the Australian mission in Seoul who are keen on this. Australia is seeing itself more and more as part of the Asian region, and they see Korea as a natural partner on many things, including on democracy. So why has Korea not done more to date in this space? The main argument I'm going to make is that the reason has to do with a mismatch of symbols and networks. Those in Korea who advance democratic symbols that resonate in the region lack the connections and interest in reaching out regionally. Those who do have the connections and interests have little command of the symbols of democracy that would resonate in the region. Political scientists give away their arguments in the beginning, so I'm kind of following that standard. So we've seen, because of this, I think we've seen very little success, and the prospects for South Korea to play a bigger role in promoting democracy in the region are not dim, but getting there is going to be an uphill battle. And toward the end of the talk, I will point to some possible ways that we might get there, what things could be done that would help us to get to that point. All right, let's go back to the buzzwords. So let's say a little bit about current Korean and American efforts to build regional and global roles for South Korea. Now, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Korea has for some time sought such a larger prominent role for the country in world affairs. There has been an embrace of the language of middle power, I think both among people in officialdom and among academics who are looking at South Korea's role in the world. Public diplomacy is another term that is used a lot, and a tool that is mobilized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to build reputation and influence around the world to start to claim this more prominent role. Regionally, we had the inauguration of the New Southern Policy under the Moon Jae-in administration. The New Southern Policy led to a reshuffling in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that granted more resources and priority to Southeast and South Asia. I think the vision for the New Southern Policy remains unclear, and I think its prospects uncertain under the current administration. Now there are claims that Korea seeks to become this global pivotal state. And under the current president, we have a second consecutive president who is seeking a larger regional and international role for Korea. And these presidents are coming from different parts of the political system in Korea. I think this is striking. Okay, we've thrown these terms out there, and we have all of this big talk from Seoul that South Korea can become a major contributor to the region and the world. Again, I think of these terms as terms that are seeking meaning. They're mostly underdefined, and we can bring meaning to them. What does it look like from the United States side? From the US, a lot of the engagement with Korea today is packaged again under the Indo-Pacific strategy. And this is a new American imagining of Asia, and it's a particular sort of imagining. It's an Asia that includes Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. It's an Asia that is maritime focused rather than continental. And it seems to be an Asia that is also defined, at least in its relations with the United States, in the context of US-China rivalry. And of course, the Indo-Pacific strategy grew a great deal in the Trump administration, and it's continued under Biden with certainly more focus on bringing some multilateralism into the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific is another word that's looking for meaning, I think. There is all of the related architecture, the Quad, AUKUS, the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. These are things that are, I think, in the process of gaining definition and being built. For South Korea, from the perspective of Washington, I think the view is, again, that Korea can play a major brokering role in these visions of the Indo-Pacific as an ally of the United States and a country with shared values and so on. And then we have joint statements from the two governments. In May of last year, there was a summit between President Moon and President Biden, and there was some joint commitment on issues that went beyond Korean Peninsula security. There was an agreement that South Korea would invest in semiconductor manufacturing in the United States, for example, partly as a way to deal with supply chain vulnerability in relation to China. And then we get, this past May, the summit between the new Korean president and President Biden. And here we have Korea accepting a role in the Indo-Pacific, in the rules-based Asia that the US envisions. The United States, meanwhile, acknowledges that South Korea has this aspiration to be a global pivotal state, and they agree to form a global partnership. This means that the partnership goes beyond military and security affairs, and it goes beyond Korean Peninsula affairs, goes beyond defense against North Korea. The commitment to a global partnership, again, if we take it seriously, sounds unprecedented. Previous US efforts to bring South Korea into regional or global security strategies have not gotten very far. The South Korean side has wanted the US alliance to focus strictly on defense against North Korea. There are a few exceptions. One would be the dispatching of Korean troops to Iraq nearly 20 years ago. Many of the issues related to bringing Korea into a broader US strategy are very sensitive in South Korea. To give one example, there is periodic discussion of strategic flexibility. This is the issue of US forces in Korea. Can they be dispatched to another part of the region, or are they there specifically for defense against North Korea? And at certain times, the US has requested strategic flexibility so that if there is a crisis, say, on the Taiwan Strait, perhaps some of the US forces stationed in Korea could be brought there. This issue has traditionally brought strong opposition from the range of the political spectrum in South Korea. Those who are more progressive see it as a kind of undermining Korean autonomy, as Korea getting mixed up in a fight that's not their own. Those who are more conservative see it as distracting from the focus that should be on the threat from North Korea. So discussion of a global partnership is really, again, rhetorically, a big shift away from how US-South Korea relations have gone so far. There are a number of pitfalls in this plan. I think the most prominent one relates to a divergence of positions on China, that South Korea, for geographic and economic reasons, is simply so much more dependent on China and therefore more vulnerable to, because of trade, because of investment, because of markets, because of communication lines, shipping lanes. They're much more vulnerable to economic retaliation from China than the United States is. And we saw that with the THAAD episode a few years back. Today, I'd like to set aside those sorts of pitfalls, set aside kind of the strategic concerns, and focus on another set of challenges. Again, these are relating specifically to the aspiration that Korea play a role in leading democracy in the region. All right, so we've gotten the buzzwords, the words seeking meanings out of the way here a little bit. And I want to shift focus quite a bit here to look at linkages between conceptions of democracy in Korea and internationalism. All right, bear with me here. We're going to look at linkages between conceptions of democracy in Korea and internationalism. One of the main meanings of democracy that we have in South Korea comes from abroad. From 1948, the Republic of Korea was established as a supposed democracy. The Constitution pulls together good American language of liberalism into a guiding document that really could not possibly resonate in a divided post-colonial society that was riven by counter-revolutionary violence. In the ensuing years, into the 1950s and 1960s, we have Korea becoming a Cold War democracy, where this gap between liberal symbology and actual power relations becomes only starker. Democracy maybe only meant anti-communism, or it meant at least an ally of the United States. As long as Seoul wasn't Pyongyang, then Korea was a democracy. And a set of political leaders at that time, and I think to date, have deployed this meaning of democracy as a bid for and a legitimation of power. And I think it tends to ring rather hollow when we look at actual records of rights protection. Then we have new ideas about democracy forming against these older ones. The anti-authoritarianism that developed in the 1970s and 1980s was nationalistic and, in a way, kind of anti-foreign. Activists and victims of the dictatorial regimes saw the United States as at least tacit supporters of the dictators that were hurting them. Again, I think the fight was really not with the United States. I think people couldn't care less about what was happening in the United States. The frustration was that a much more powerful country seemed to be supporting leaders who were hurting us. The violence at Gwangju is kind of the peak of all of this, and the main grievance there is not that the United States caused it, but that the United States did not intervene and allowed troops to move into Gwangju. So these activists imagine a Korean nation, unified, unimpeded by American and Soviet intervention in those earlier years. This is, of course, the Minjung movement that's been written about by Professor Inami and others. Some of these activists questioned the Republic of Korea project altogether. Others did not. It was a broad tent, or like a landscape of a lot of small tents, or however that metaphor works. I think the ideas that were powered by this movement eventually led to the falling of the dictators and an actual democratization of Korean society. And this notion of democracy as a component of nationalism has remained a core one, and it's associated with the people who are really the most committed Democrats in Korea. All right, I think you can kind of see where I'm going with this. We have a notion of democracy that is inward-looking and difficult to put together with a cosmopolitan worldview. And I'm going to expand on that, but I have a little bit of a tangent that I'd like to go into here. And I think this latter notion of democracy is sometimes critiqued or criticized from abroad as being xenophobic. I've seen this regularly in commentary in the US and in analysis of topics such as anti-US sentiment. My own view is I don't think there's really ever been such a thing as anti-US sentiment in Korea. I think other things are going on there. We can talk about that possibly later. Progressive administrations and actors have been accused of having anti-foreign or parochial views. They seem to be against a liberal cosmopolitanism, as if Korea's committed Democrats speak liberalism with a hillbilly accent. Now, I think there is a strong anti-foreign tinge to liberal thinking in Korea. This needs to be contextualized, but I think we can also note that Korea is not alone in infusing its democratic pride with anti-foreign nationalism. I think we see a similar thing in the United States. A lot of the myths about American democracy and the founding of democracy in America are also about contrasting it with tradition and hierarchy in Europe. And we see this in kind of the mundane worship of the nation as well. I saw this recently in a film series. Our local cinema was giving free showings of this Ken Burns documentary series from about 10 years ago about national parks. I think it was called America's Best Idea. A nice series. So I took our 9-year-old there. He gets to go to the cinema on a school night. It's kind of nice. He doesn't know how to behave in the cinema. He's 9, and there's COVID, so he hasn't had much experience. So he's talking, asking questions the whole time, and clapping embarrassingly loudly at the end. But in the first episode of this series, there is a set of historians who come out and talk about how the establishment of Yosemite and Yellowstone represented the first time in human history that patches of nature were set aside for anyone to enjoy. And then this goes right into the Europe bashing, that in Europe, well, it was only the nobility that had access to the land and nobody else did. I'm not an historian of Europe or the United States, but the parts of Europe that I'm familiar with, there's a lot more access to common land for everybody, and there's traditions of that. And there were a lot of rules about how you could use the land. And my immediate thought was, well, in the US, there was kind of an extreme privatization of land and then an exhortation, even in the 19th century, to exploit that land for your own purposes. And so the creation of national parks is more like the second part of a Polanyi-esque double movement to protect what was being eroded. Anyway, the point was that the form that this was presented, it was about a certain kind of anti-foreign pride in a democratic idea. That was the presentation here, that it was a democratic idea to create these national parks. So I think South Korea is not unique in connecting pride in its democracy with nationalism, with a nationalism that can be tinged with some anti-foreign sentiment. But I think we can also better specify the anti-foreign elements in a nationalistic democracy in Korea. A first part is that Koreans did not get to have a constitution writing moment as a magic moment in their national and democratic founding. The Constitution was partly imposed from outside, and in fact, we do not really know the history of the writing of the Constitution. We do not know the debates and the positions that occurred in the writing of the Constitution. And if you haven't even got that history, how can you have pride in that as a magical or charismatic moment in your nation's democratic history? Instead, we have a democracy that became infused with meaning through the rejection of structures that were seen as imposed from without, and a rejection of other Koreans who gained and maintained their power by toadying up to brokers of more powerful places. It was opposition to those who had gained under the Japanese and then again under the Americans. There can be also some deeper history, thinking about geography and the imperative on the Korean Peninsula to get along between major powers, not just other countries that were equal to Korea. And of course, there is some similarity between this strand of thought in South Korea and thinking in North Korea in the emphasis on autonomy. And I think given the history, the geopolitics, and the geography, there's something here that's understandable. I'm not trying to justify or condone any jingoism on either side of the Korean Peninsula, but rather to understand empathetically how a construction of democracy has come about in a particular place. Foreign has tended to mean, in South Korea, the United States and Japan. It's meant these outside powers, far stronger than Korea, asymmetrical, with records of disrupting Korean affairs. Okay, so we have this meaning, really deep meaning of democracy in South Korea that is tied to a particular post-colonial anti-authoritarian context, and it comes with an inward-looking aspiration for autonomy. There's yet another twist on this, and this relates to the division of the Korean Peninsula. Some prominent intellectuals in Korea, especially Baek Nak-chung, they point out that persistent division and hostility on the peninsula is the primary barrier not just to fulfilling a national dream of unification, but to deepening democracy for South Korea. The logic here is this: division justifies security measures that infringe on democratic rights and processes. This can be seen in something like the National Security Act and how it has been used. It can be seen in terms of making a lot of information secret on national security grounds. It can happen when non-prescribed procedures are followed in the name of national security. It's becomes kind of like a loophole democracy. There's always a reason that you can go around the rights that are put into the Constitution or other legal documents. Furthermore, this logic goes, leaders in both North and South Korea know about this and therefore try to make the most of it. That is, they have an interest in maintaining conflict so that they can use these loopholes. So this twist means that there's yet another reason for an emphasis on kind of Korean Peninsula first in thinking about democracy in South Korea. All right, so what we get then in South Korea is a set of committed democrats who they've made democracy their own. They've given it their own meaning. And they've given it meaning in a context that may resonate more with other contexts in the Asian region. And I think this is a major accomplishment. The priorities, though, are at home. They're suspicious of those that have too many foreign, again, meaning especially American or Japanese ties. Many in this camp also do not seek international attention or influence. Some are even reluctant to use English. I've encountered people who speak English but will not speak English to me. And I think that is somewhat revealing of how they're thinking about democracy and internationalism. English is not treated sometimes as a practical language for speaking with equals who come from other places, but as kind of a tool of the metropole. Maybe wrongly, but I think there is something of that attitude. And refusing to speak English under certain circumstances is a bit of a way to stick it to the man. There are, of course, more outward-looking people in Korea, a lot of them. And these people are better positioned to build foreign ties and do things like create a more prominent international role for South Korea. For many of these, the United States is the priority, both for individual status reasons as well as for diplomatic reasons. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs puts most of its resources in that direction. But many of these types have much weaker democratic credentials. They adopt and deploy more lip-service notions of democracy, similar to the ones that were used during the Cold War. So we have less substance and less linkage to Korea's context, to meanings of democracy that have worked in that context, coming from those with those connections. There's another group. We also have what we could call the Asia-facing side of the South Korean state. We now have very strong connections between the South Korean state and economy and much of Southeast Asia, which is, I think, an area where Korea can become a regional leader. This is in terms of investment, trade, development assistance, tourism, migrant labor, women going up to be brides in Korea, and so on. One of the dominant forces in this relationship is the Ministry of Finance, which works together with conglomerates from Korea. They undertake investments in the region that are sometimes treated as development assistance. Public funding and support is made available to these large Korean firms to build, to get engaged in infrastructure projects in particular in Southeast Asia. So we have this excess capital within South Korea being shifted to other parts of the region and world. Partly, well, I think the construction sector has less to do in Korea. Many things have been built, and so where it can expand is to go overseas. And so the Ministry of Finance helps their friends in the conglomerates, following some of the old political economy structure, to seize windfall revenues from abroad, while publicly citing the contributions to Korean GDP that these projects make. This side of the Korean state has strikingly little democratic oversight. I think there's a real dissonance between what we see the Korean state doing in these sorts of activities in Southeast Asia, in some other parts of the world, and the way other parts of the Korean state operate within South Korea. There's very little accountability. Many people in Southeast Asia, they have their livelihood, lives put in a vulnerable position, the environment. A few years ago, there was a dam in Laos that collapsed, and it's very difficult to see who in Korea or Thailand that were bankrolling this project will take accountability for that. Okay, so through this Asia-facing side of the Korean state, we have regional prominence and networks, but it's divorced from the meanings of democracy that have grown up in Korea. I'd like to turn now and look at what we might call openings, some moments where people in Korea, and actually outside of Korea, have linked up to the deeply meaningful notions of democracy in Korea to create something a little bit regional. I have 5 of these openings. A first one was in the late 1990s. There was an interesting event. I was not there. There was an interesting event that included speeches read on behalf of Kim Dae-jung, Corazon Aquino, and Aung San Suu Kyi. There's a book was published subsequently that has these speeches, and it's really fascinating because we have these huge leaders who have lived the experience of struggling against authoritarianism and have tried to bring ideas about democracy to their context and make it meaningful in their context. And then they're engaging each other in this forum. We have a genuinely regional discussion of democracy there. There was no follow-up from that. Another opening is with an NGO that in Korea that used to be called ODA Watch, Overseas Development Assistance Watch. And this is a set of activists who track the activities of KOICA, the Overseas Development Assistance arm of the Korean government. They do things like visit Cambodia, visit communities where KOICA has projects, and talk to locals and say, sort of, how is this project impacting you? So they want to try to provide some of that accountability that we do not see with this side of the Korean state. These are really amazing, committed people, but they're kind of a ragtag group. It's a small number of people. I attended one of their events. It was an anniversary celebration that was, they called a birthday party, and they had a cake, and it was a very small number of people in the room. So there's great spirit, but there's a real limit to the scale that they have. Another opening I noticed was the response in early 2021 to the coup in Myanmar. In South Korea, the coup was presented as like Gwangju. And that message immediately resonated with people in Korea. This is like Gwangju. Here we have a government doing violence against its people, just like we had happen in 1980. And so it led to very quick mass support, sympathy for people in Myanmar, and the Korean government also responded pretty rapidly as well. So this is a case where the Korean experience kind of directly maps over into the experience of another country and has the potential to create real solidarity. A fourth opening, apparently, in some parts of Southeast Asia, such as, again, Myanmar or Thailand, K-pop fan groups become the organizational networks for anti-authoritarian activism. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Korea Foundation could not have planned that. Nobody could have planned that. But that's really interesting stuff. There is something resonating there that is holding together young people in another part of the region who are struggling in politics. A fifth and final opening would be the New Southern Policy. And I see the New Southern Policy as lending official recognition to the connections that had already really developed. That is, by the time it was announced, South Korea has really become much more a part of Asia, or of that part of Asia, than it has in the past. And this lens is a first step to lending some recognition to that belonging to the region. Again, I think there is not much sense of what the vision exactly is there, but there is a recognition that Korea is more a part of the region. So in all of these openings, I see something promising, and there's some really impressive people working in these spaces. But they tend to get caught up, I think, in this mismatch of ideas and networks or resources. Okay, to wrap up here, let me make a few remarks on what we might expect in the future. How could it be that Korea comes to play a contributing role to democracy in the region? Well, if this global pivotal state or the activities that South Korea undertakes in the region follow the more internationalist Ministry of Foreign Affairs bent, then I think Korea could face a situation where they are met with some suspicion by their neighbors in the region. Countries in Southeast Asia might see South Korea as really just a proxy for the United States. And they've spent so much time, and it's getting more intense, caught in US-China rivalry, that they're wise to those things. I think this is a danger. I think what we're seeing in Asia is a competition among many actors to redefine connectivity and what the region is. From China, we have the Belt and Road Initiative and a series of other projects that are not necessarily affiliated with that create new connections and establish new forms of dependency. From the United States, we have this Indo-Pacific thing. And I think there's space to help shape what the region is, and Korea can play a role in that. I think a promising approach would be to try to Asianize democracy. I borrow the word Asianization from a colleague and sociologist, Chang Young-sup. And what I mean by an Asianization of democracy is to take the ideas about democracy that have developed in South Korea and make them relevant to other parts of the region. I think there is something in these ideas that will resonate in other places, and we have evidence for that. But they need to be more actively shared and tested out in other contexts. Just to make sure I'm not misunderstood here, I emphatically do not mean some sort of essentialist nonsense about bringing Asia to another civilization. Instead, it's about Koreans building up and out from their own notions of democracy to engage other parts of the region. Again, on the basis of some similarities in shared context. Cold War histories of dealing with authoritarian governments, post-colonialism, and so on. I think these historical experiences and memories of these experiences can lend real meanings to democracy and actually to a wider variety of deeply meaningful notions of democracy in the region. I think for this sort of Asianization of democracy to happen, a few other things would help. A first would be that Korea can invest more in developing knowledge of and interest in Southeast and South Asia. This can be done through promoting language study, through promoting exchange, and I think it has to go beyond kind of pro forma sharing of deep cultural traditions to sharing things that are actually interesting to people from other countries in those places. And I think there are plenty of them. There can be more done to build alliances across the region, for example, between NGOs. I think Korea can also use some of the leverage it has and the history of its alliance with the United States to educate Washington on what democracy in the region could mean. And finally, I think Washington needs the humility to listen to its partner in Asia. And if it has that kind of humility, then there can, I think, be some success in Korea playing a leading role in democracy in the region. And I think this would also serve American interests. Thank you.
So I'm happy to moderate. I have time, about 15, 20 minutes for Q&A. Yes, Mary.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One question I have is about I thought it was really interesting because I don't know that much about domestic Korean politics, but the idea that the democratic movement has a kind of strong kind of nativist or xenophobic, and that foreign is really defined by the U.S. and Japan. So it's probably an obvious question coming from a China specialist, but with the increasing economic integration with China, and then more recently, like a very stark downturn in relations, partly around the missile, the retribution for the missile installations in 2017, and then after COVID, Pew just put out new global attitudes towards China, and South Korea is at 80% unfavorable, so that's a big shift, and it surprises me. And so my question to you is, has that changed the way in which South Koreans view these other foreign powers, which are also, strong powers and also in the region, like United States and Japan? My second question was, sorry, I wrote it down, was about soft culture and soft power and K-pop. This is just a very naive question because I don't know that much about K-pop anyway, but how has K-pop become political? I don't think of K-pop as political, and yet I know it's had this kind of interesting, like you were saying, political effect. And I agree with you that it's totally unintentional and really amazing. But it's interesting to see that it's also having not just like, it's expanding people's desire to learn about Korea and to learn Korean language, but that it's also had like a kind of, as you said, anti-authoritarian bent to it.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Right, the wave of frustration with China was something that the current president played up a lot in his campaign. I think trying to portray it as kind of an either-or, either with China and the U.S. or with the U.S. And I think there's a lot of that in U.S. commentary as well that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, I have to say. I don't see any Korean leaders ever being in a position where they're choosing between the United States and China. The Republic of Korea has always been a U.S. ally, and that has not been questioned under any government. It's just that the vulnerabilities change vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis North Korea. As North Korea develops longer-range missiles and has nuclear powers, then the risk becomes different to South Korea versus Japan and the United States. And similarly with China, Korea has become vulnerable to China in ways that, or to degrees that the United States is not. Maybe we could read some of the frustration with China in terms of that position. This is a partial answer. Maybe somebody else could say more there on that question. On soft power and K-pop in other parts of Asia, I think getting a full answer to this requires research, and it requires actually us as academics to also break through some of our boundaries and have Southeast Asianists and East Asianists collaborate to figure out what's going on. And I think I have colleagues who focus on Southeast Asia who are keen on this because suddenly Korea has drifted into their field and they need to figure out what's going on. So there is research that needs to be done on these particular groups, on activist networks in Southeast Asia, and why this connection is made. I think South Korean popular culture has become almost dominant in many parts of Southeast Asia to a degree that maybe is not even appreciated by the public diplomacy people in Korea, who tend again to be more oriented to United States and Japan.
Thanks for really thought-provoking talk. I want to ask a question about how religion, especially Christian network, would factor into the picture that you just drew for us. So I'm sort of thinking about, conservative Christians presenting themselves as bringing democracy and human rights to North Korea and the broader world, which may not necessarily align well with a kind of sort of democratic symbols and the history of pro-democratic social movement in Korea. Also, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia are Muslim majority countries, and certainly South Korean Christian missionary network is broad. It plays a certain role in actually sending people to those countries, and also contributes to a newly emerging Islamophobia in South Korea. And oftentimes the target of that Islamophobia are migrant population from Southeast Asian countries. So that again, having some sort of global network, having certain ideas about democracy and human rights that may align better with the U.S. idea of human right and democracy, and South Korea carrying the torch, rather than the kind of symbol and stories of a pro-democracy movement in South Korea. So there's another picture that you haven't really touched in the talk. So I want to hear your thoughts about that.
That's an interesting point. One can't generalize anything about religion and politics in South Korea, because one of the beautiful things is just the heterogeneity of religious life in Korea and the range of relationships that different religious groups or even similar religious groups have to politics. So there's a lot, again, this is a field that needs a lot more study. It's really difficult to do because you need insiders who can maintain distance. You need people who know doctrine and organization from the inside, but can establish a distance to study it properly. And it's demanding research, but it's very difficult research to do. I think having any sort of evangelical approach to spreading an idea like democracy or human rights is, as you say, not going to help us here. What I'm suggesting are a very different set of networks. Are there Christian groups that go around spreading democracy in a way that's listening to local stories? I'm not sure, but I would certainly be wary of attempts to bring ideas from outside and inculcate them on local populations. I think that's exactly where the suspicions will arise, that this is kind of U.S. power behind the scene, and this can get us in trouble with others.
I have a question from the virtual audience, and it's from David Roden, and the question is, what are the obstacles to closer Japanese relations? It never seems to change.
That's tough. That's tough. There are many obstacles there. I think, let me answer a little bit obliquely. I mentioned Korea not having that magical moment of constitution founding. Japan also did not. And I think from the United States, when we look at that part of the world, I think there should be some appreciation of that. and of the historic US role in that, using a large amount of power to have enormous influence on who has power in another society can have lasting consequences. And there are perceptions of the ways that Americans meddled in power, in the power structures in Japan after World War II, that are kind of difficult to move beyond. I think it's difficult in Korea to accept a celebration of the Japanese nation, given that kind of tinkering. So I think that creates some real difficulties, and I think from the US side, again, just telling these allies to get along with each other doesn't do justice to that sort of history in which the United States is also implicated. Perhaps one way forward is if Koreans and Japanese interact less as Koreans and Japanese, go more transnational rather than international, finding common areas where certain groups in Japan and certain groups in Korea have something in common, an issue, maybe an environmental issue that they share, and work together on that. And that might be one starting point for better ties.
Yeah, thank you for this really interesting talk. I'm curious to know about what you talk a lot about, the meaning of democracy and how these new buzzwords to define international relations are still seeking meanings, and how can the role of democracy can play something here, right? And so I think in the region, a big part of how people define democracy is about people are worried about a lot of this former dictators, family, friends, ally would come back anytime soon, and this is probably why we saw the mass protests happen in Korea a few years back, and similar thing happened in Taiwan as well. And so I guess my question is, this kind of worry or concern or struggle about former authoritarian legacy in the region would be, to what extent that would be something to be considered in a vision of Washington, in terms of promoting this new global partnership with the consideration of democracy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I could imagine if you're able to establish more of these networks at an activist level or even a scholarly level, I think the amount of discussion that happens within Asia directly between scholars of the region, in the region, is remarkably poor. It's just there's so little of it. But if you were to have more of that discussion about what are our democratic challenges, then the theme you highlight of would bring people together, of the worry about people from the authoritarian era returning. This would be a common theme to talk about, to work through, maybe to build strategies to defend against. This is not something that you would imagine, you would just think up sitting in the United States reflecting on theoretical or American versions of democracy. But if you're in the region and thinking about, right, Korea, the Philippines is the main one today, right? Thailand, and some other places, then this would be a real talking point. I think you're right.
Thank you for the talk, Professor Mobrand. My question is related to the point that you made about the inward turn of Korean democracy. So if we look back at the 1970s, when Park Chung-hee articulated this sentiment by promoting Korean-style democracy as opposed to European liberal democracy, saying that it would not be suitable for the South Korean context, how can we reconcile this sentiment with the fact that it has been echoed in progressive administrations, as you mentioned, and is it realistic to envision a scenario where the inward turn becomes outward and it relinquishes this nationalist tinge? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think I think you're right to point that out. I think there are multiple articulations of a kind of Koreanized democracy. Park Jung-hee, Lee Seung-man talked about these things, but we know these were just excuses, right, for avoiding democratic structures. And so I think something very different is going on in those claims than in the kind of inward, a penchant for looking inwards that we see among these other sorts of democrats that I'm describing. I think it's something very different. I think it's just that the priority is on Korea, and there's a concern with autonomy. I think there is potential to encourage some of these people in these circles to be a little more cosmopolitan, to look abroad, and I do see that in these openings. So with the people that are following what Koike does in other places, that's the sentiment they bring. These are people who are curious about other places, who think they have a responsibility as citizens of Korea to watch what their country is doing in another place. So it is there, and if we are trying to encourage this, then I encourage Korean friends to try to build up their curiosity about these other places and explore more what people are talking about there. And I think it's possible to build that sentiment. But I think it has to come from there. It cannot come from people who already have this cosmopolitan orientation, but not the democratic basis.
So one comment and one question. I think what Adelina just pointed out, I think there are two modifiers now to democracy in Korea that kind of neatly align with these two different positions. One is 자유 and the other is 주권. So to the extent that you put 자유 or freedom or free or liberal in front of 민주주의 or democracy, that's already a shorthand for a genealogy that goes back to sort of the authoritarian era.
Yeah.
And then if you put sovereigntist or 주권 in front of 민주주의 or democracy, then it's a code word to recognize your genealogy as one that's within the 운동권 or the resistance movement or anti-authoritarianism. I have one question for you, and it's a very broad question. So I'm fixated on the word mismatch that came up in your talk. And I think asymmetry was also talked about. I'm reminded of the diplomatic historian Lloyd Gardner's sort of a summary of U.S.-Korea relations, especially U.S. policy on Korea. And his, again, shorthand for that was a policy of somewhere else. So United States policy on Korea was always about somewhere else. And that's to be expected. You would expect United States policy during the Cold War era to prioritize the Soviet Union and now Korea, and any number of things. I mean, today you could talk about China and Korea in that regard. I think for Koreans, this is a moral anathema and disgrace that cannot be allowed to stand. There's something about it that goes back to the colonial era, to colonial legacy, that makes it very difficult for Koreans to just accept it as realpolitik. And the moment that you feel that the policy is about someplace else, the conversation will stop right there. Whereas I think in the United States, and maybe your perspective from within the RAND can shed light on this, how else can you do policy as a global superpower? You have to prioritize big and small matters. So I see a fundamental mismatch there that makes the conversation, diplomatic conversation, and collaboration somewhat challenged. Do Koreans just have to accept that this is not a moral anathema and just adopt realpolitik approach to U.S.-Korea relations?
Thanks. Both for that comment, which is helpful, and the question. I spoke about terms that are looking for meanings. That's a way to be a little bit less critical of terms that may not have meanings. But I want to maintain that tone of looking for opportunities for everyone here. Now, I think Koreans may read into the Indo-Pacific strategy and perhaps ideas from Washington about Korea's place in that as being policies that are not really about Korea. They're about protecting the US against China. And what I'm suggesting here is that perhaps one positive way to respond is to know, look, the US is going to need assistance in defining what the Indo-Pacific is. So why not take this as an opportunity to help in that definition? The US cannot do this all alone and serve its own interests. So is there not space for Korea to serve its own interests while also working with the United States to build up the region? And what I'm saying here is that there are serious challenges. It's not nearly as easy as the rhetoric suggests. So just because Korea is a democracy, US is democracy, they can get along on democracy in the region? No. Because of the dangers of a more evangelical approach that is going to be sussed out for what it really is. There's a more difficult approach that could be taken that I think can be actually, again, maybe I'm too optimistic, but it can be satisfying to all partners. It can serve the US interest in building an Indo-Pacific. There's still questions about China and to what extent regional engagements include China versus exclude. Korea is going to have to work through those. But this can also serve Korean and regional interests at the same time, possibly. I do think that.
Great, thank you so much. I have one announcement. Thank you, Dr. Mobrand. We'll continue to talk.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So please join us on November 16th for our next colloquium. We'll have Professor Ji-Hyung Harrison Kim from University of Hawaii. He'll be giving a talk on machines of the quotidian, architecture and technology in post-war North Korea. Okay, thank you all for joining, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.